Medieval families could keep fire burning for 5 days straight using nothing but ash and coals. The technique was called banking, and it worked because ash is an insulator. When layered over hot coals, it starves them of oxygen just enough to slow combustion without extinguishing it completely. This created smoldering embers that stayed hot for days, ready to burst into flame with fresh fuel. Modern camping guides call this fire preservation. Medieval households called it survival. Before matches existed, fire was precious, not convenient, not guaranteed. Precious. Starting fire from scratch required flint, steel, tinder, and skill. The process took anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes under good conditions. Wet weather? Double or triple that time. Cold fingers fumbling with materials on a winter morning? Even longer. So medieval households did something modern people have almost completely forgotten. They kept fires burning continuously, not blazing, not consuming massive amounts of fuel, just burning, slowly, efficiently, ready to provide heat and flame when needed. The question isn't whether they could do this. Archaeological and historical records confirm they did. The question is how. Specifically, how they maintained fire for days or even weeks without constant attention and without burning through their entire winter fuel supply in a month. The answer involves a technique so simple it seems too basic to matter, yet so effective that families across medieval Europe used it daily for centuries. It's called banking a fire, and it relies on a material we consider waste: ash. The physics are straightforward. The application required skill and understanding. And the results meant the difference between warmth and cold, between food and hunger, between a quick morning fire and an hour of frustration while your family waited to eat. This isn't theoretical reconstruction. People who heat with wood stoves today still use banking techniques descended directly from medieval practice. The method works. It has always worked. We've just forgotten why it matters. Banking a fire starts with understanding what fire actually needs to burn: fuel, heat, and oxygen. Take away any one of these three elements and the fire goes out. Reduce oxygen flow to barely sustainable levels while maintaining heat, and combustion slows to a crawl. The fuel, wood transformed into charcoal, charcoal transformed into glowing coals, can burn for hours or days at this reduced rate. Ash is the key material. When wood burns completely, it leaves behind ash, primarily calcium carbonate, and other mineral compounds that don't combust. This ash is light, powdery, and crucially, an excellent insulator. Here's how medieval families used it. First, let your evening fire burn down until the wood had mostly reduced to coals. These coals glowed red or orange, radiating substantial heat. This stage typically occurred after several hours of burning during cooking and evening activities. Second, if any large pieces of wood remained with active flame, pull them to the sides of the hearth and let them go out. The goal was a bed of hot coals, not blazing logs. Third, using a fire rake or poker, gather these coals into a compact pile against the back wall of the fireplace or the center of the hearth. Concentration of coals maintained higher heat in a smaller area. Fourth, and this is where the technique becomes crucial, cover the piled coals with a layer of ash. Not dirt, not sand. Ash, specifically, taken from previous fires. The ash layer needed to be thick enough to significantly restrict airflow, but not so thick it completely smothered the coals. The right thickness varied depending on several factors: how long you wanted the fire to last, what type of coals you had, ambient temperature, and humidity. This knowledge came through experience. For overnight banking, 8 to 12 hours, The ash layer might be 1 to 2 inches thick. For longer, preservation. It could be thicker. Fifth, place 1 or 2 small logs on top of the ash-covered coals. These logs served multiple purposes. They provided additional insulation, they offered fuel ready to ignite when the fire was revived, and they protected the coals from drafts that might either extinguish them or cause them to flare up unsafely. That's the complete technique. No special equipment, no exotic materials, just coals, ash, and understanding. What happened beneath that ash layer was elegant chemistry. The ash reduced oxygen availability to the coals. Unable to burn vigorously, the coals entered a slow smolder. They remained hot, sometimes hot enough to glow faintly when exposed, but consumed fuel at a fraction of the normal rate. The ash acted as both insulator and oxygen regulator. It trapped heat around the coals while allowing just enough air permeation to prevent complete extinction. The coals essentially held in a state of suspended animation, waiting to burst back to life when given fresh air and fuel. Banking techniques varied across medieval Europe based on local conditions, available materials, and specific needs. In England and France, families sometimes used specialized equipment called a couvre-feu, or curfew cover, a ceramic or metal dome placed over the banked coals. These covers provided additional protection and control. The dome trapped heat, while a small opening at the bottom or sides allowed minimal airflow. The word curfew itself derives from this practice. Couvre-feu in French literally means cover the fire. When William the Conqueror established evening curfew bells in 1068, they signaled the time when households should bank their fires and retire for the night. The bells served both fire safety, preventing unattended flames, and fire preservation, ensuring morning coals remained viable. In regions where ceramic covers weren't available or affordable, families achieved similar results through ash technique alone. Some raked ash not just over, but completely around the coal pile, creating a dome-shaped mound that served the same insulating function as a ceramic cover. The specific banking method also depended on the fire's intended duration. For overnight banking, 8 to 12 hours, the technique described earlier worked perfectly. In the morning, someone would rake away the ash layer, expose the coals, add small kindling, and gently blow on the coals. Within minutes, flames appeared. Add larger wood, and the fire was fully functional. For longer preservation, multiple days, the banking technique required modification. The coal pile needed to be larger initially, the ash layer needed to be thicker, and the logs placed on top needed to be more substantial. Historical accounts and practical experimentation confirmed that properly banked coals could remain viable for 3 to 5 days. After that point, heat loss to the surrounding environment eventually cooled the coals below rekindling. Temperature. The type of wood and coals also mattered significantly. Hardwoods like oak, beech, and ash produced dense coals that held heat longer and were ideal for banking. These woods burned slower and formed substantial coal beds that could survive extended banking periods. Softwoods like pine and fir burned hotter initially, but created less durable coals. They were less suitable for multi-day banking, but worked fine for overnight preservation. Charcoal, wood that had been partially burned in low oxygen conditions, was premium banking fuel when available. Charcoal coals burned extremely slowly and could remain hot under ash for even longer periods than wood coals. Medieval households carefully managed their fire based on fuel type. They burned softwoods during active cooking when they needed intense heat. They burned hardwoods in the evening specifically to create good coals for banking. They reserved charcoal for situations where they needed extended fire preservation or consistent low heat. Why go through this effort? Why not just let the fire go out and restart it each day? The reasons were both practical and economic. First, time savings. Starting fire from flint and steel took 10 to 20 minutes of focused effort. Banking and revival took 2 to 3 minutes. For a family rising at dawn to prepare food and begin work, those 15 saved minutes mattered. Multiply that daily time savings across an entire winter, October through April in much of Europe, and banking saved dozens of hours annually. Second, fuel efficiency. A properly banked fire preserved existing coals rather than letting them burn to cold ash overnight. Those preserved coals represented fuel already partially consumed that could continue providing value. Letting them burn out completely or cool completely wasted the remaining energy they contained. Additionally, starting fire from scratch often required kindling and fast-burning materials to establish initial flames. These materials, small twigs, wood shavings, bark, weren't free. They had to be gathered, prepared, and stored. Banking eliminated this daily kindling consumption. Third, reliability. Flint and steel starting required dry tinder and favorable conditions. Damp weather made fire starting significantly harder. Banking meant you always had hot coals ready, regardless of outside conditions. This reliability was crucial during extended wet periods or harsh winter weather when gathering dry tinder might be difficult or impossible. Fourth, continuous heat. A banked fire didn't provide active flames, but it did provide gentle heat radiating from the hearth mass. In cold climates, this overnight warmth kept the living space from falling to outside temperatures. While not enough to maintain full comfort, it prevented the brutal cold that would occur in an unheated house. The thermal mass of the stone or brick hearth absorbed heat during the day's fire. Overnight, with coals still smoldering beneath ash, this mass continued radiating stored heat into the room. The effect was subtle but meaningful. The difference between waking to a room at 45 degrees versus 30 degrees. Fifth, cooking preparedness. Medieval households prepared the day's first meal immediately upon rising. Having hot coals ready meant cooking could begin within minutes of waking. Without banking, food preparation had to wait for fire starting, meaning delayed meals and later starts to the workday. For a farming household or craft workshop where daylight hours were precious, this time, efficiency accumulated into tangible productivity gains across seasons. The practice was so integral to medieval life that children learned banking as a fundamental household skill. Woe to the child whose responsibility was fire watching, who let the family's fire go out, as historical sources occasionally mention. The inconvenience affected everyone. Banking fires was universal practice across medieval Europe, yet most modern people have never heard of it. How did we lose this knowledge? The answer is simple. We stopped needing it. Matches became commercially available in the early 19th century. Suddenly, starting fire took seconds instead of minutes. The precious nature of fire, the need to preserve it constantly, disappeared. Modern heating systems replaced hearth fires. Central heating, furnaces, radiators, and eventually forced air systems eliminated the daily interaction with fire that medieval people experienced. Fire became something you started occasionally in a fireplace for ambiance, not something you maintained constantly for survival. The knowledge persisted longest in rural areas and regions where traditional heating methods continued by economic necessity rather than choice. In parts of Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and rural Americas, wood stove heating remained common into the 20th century. In these places, banking techniques survived because they remained practically useful. People who heat primarily with wood stoves today still practice banking. They've often rediscovered the technique through trial and error, or learned it from older generations who never stopped using it. The physics hasn't changed. The technique hasn't changed. Only the cultural transmission broke down. What's remarkable is how quickly comprehensive knowledge can vanish. Banking was practiced daily by millions of people for centuries. Within 3 generations of matches and modern heating becoming widespread, it had become obscure knowledge. Within 5 generations, it was almost completely forgotten, except among specialists and off-grid enthusiasts. This pattern repeats throughout history. Practical skills that seem universal and permanent disappear rapidly when conditions change. The knowledge exists as long as people actively practice it. When practice stops, knowledge erodes within decades. The banking technique is preserved now primarily through historical, recreation, experimental archaeology, and the experiences of modern wood stove users who've independently rediscovered methods that were once universal. The irony is that banking remains just as effective today as it was in 1068. The physics of ash insulation and oxygen restriction hasn't changed. Anyone maintaining fire in a wood stove or fireplace can use these techniques to reduce fuel consumption and maintain coals for extended periods. Understanding why banking works requires looking at combustion at the molecular level. Wood burning is oxidation. Oxygen molecules combining with carbon in the wood, releasing energy as heat and light. The speed of this reaction depends primarily on oxygen availability and temperature. In open air with unlimited oxygen, wood burns vigorously. The reaction proceeds quickly, consuming fuel rapidly and producing high heat and visible flames. This is what we see in an active fire. Restrict oxygen supply while maintaining temperature, and the reaction slows dramatically. The same chemical process continues, carbon combining with oxygen, but at a fraction of the normal rate. The fuel lasts much longer. Heat production drops but doesn't stop entirely. Ash creates this oxygen restriction through its physical properties. It's composed of tiny particles with irregular shapes and surfaces. When layered over coals, these particles form a porous but restrictive barrier. Air can move through ash. It's not airtight, but the movement is severely limited compared to open exposure. Additionally, ash is an excellent thermal insulator. It has low thermal conductivity, meaning heat doesn't transfer through it easily. This trapped heat around the coals, maintaining the temperature necessary for slow combustion to continue. The coal itself matters too. When wood burns down to coals, it has been transformed largely into carbon, charcoal. Carbon burns more slowly than wood at the same temperature because it's already partially oxidized. Its structure is also denser, with less surface area relative to volume, which further slows combustion rate. Hot charcoal coals beneath an ash layer essentially exist in a low-oxygen, high-temperature environment. They continue oxidizing slowly enough that they can last for hours or days before cooling below rekindling temperature or consuming all available fuel. The technique works because it exploits a narrow operational range. Too little oxygen and the coals go out completely. Too much oxygen and they burn away quickly. The right amount of ash creates the perfect middle ground, enough oxygen for continued combustion, little enough that the process proceeds very slowly. This is why banking required skill. The variables were numerous: coal size and type, ash amount and consistency, ambient temperature, humidity, airflow patterns in the hearth. Experienced firekeepers developed intuitive understanding of these factors and adjusted their technique accordingly. So how did medieval families keep fire burning for 5 days straight? They understood that fire doesn't have to be flame. Fire can be slow combustion. Coals smoldering beneath ash, burning so gradually that the same fuel that would vanish in an hour when fully exposed could last for days when properly banked. The technique was elegantly simple. Hot coals, covered with ash, insulated with small logs. The ash restricted oxygen flow just enough to slow combustion without extinguishing it. The coals remained hot, ready to burst back to flames when exposed to air and given fresh fuel. This wasn't advanced technology. It was applied understanding of basic physics. Combustion requires fuel, heat, and oxygen. Reduce oxygen availability while maintaining heat and fuel, and combustion continues at a dramatically slower rate. Medieval families practiced this technique daily out of practical necessity. Starting fire was difficult and time-consuming. Maintaining fire through banking was easy and efficient. The choice was obvious. We've lost this knowledge not because it stopped working, but because we stopped needing it. Modern convenience, matches, lighters, central heating, eliminated the practical incentive to preserve fire constantly. Within a few generations, universal knowledge became obscure specialty information, but the technique remains just as effective today as it was 1,000 years ago. Anyone heating with wood can use banking to reduce fuel consumption, maintain coals overnight, and simplify fire management. The physics hasn't changed. Only our relationship with fire has. The medieval trick that made fire burn 5 days straight wasn't a trick at all. It was understanding. Understanding that ash insulates, that coals smolder, that fire preserved is easier than fire started anew. It was knowledge refined through daily practice across centuries, passed from generation to generation as essential household skill. We've forgotten it because we haven't needed it for 100 years. But the knowledge is still there, still valid, still useful for anyone willing to learn what medieval families knew instinctively: that fire, properly banked, will wait patiently beneath its ash blanket for however long you need it.